Tonight, we delve into a collection of texts so forbidden, so powerful, that for centuries they were hidden in silence beneath the sands of Egypt. A library not forged by kings or emperors, but by thinkers, mystics, and early Christians whose visions challenged the authority of the Church. Its pages reveal cosmologies, secret teachings, and hidden knowledge that question everything we thought we knew about faith, creation, and the soul. The Nag Hammadi codices were buried, sealed, and nearly lost to time, preserved only by those who dared to defy orthodoxy and protect their secrets from confiscation and destruction. And when these texts resurfaced in 1945, they sent shockwaves through scholarship, revealing a Christianity far more diverse, mystical, and contested than history had ever admitted. What did these early communities know about God, the cosmos, and salvation that the official records tried to erase? And what does it mean for the way we understand the past today? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. In the dry hills of Upper Egypt, history did not announce itself with trumpets or temples. It waited silently in the earth. In the year 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi along the Nile, local farmers digging for fertilizer struck something hard and unexpected. Buried beneath the soil was a sealed clay jar, tall, heavy, and untouched for centuries. Inside were 12 leather-bound papyrus books and part of a 13th, stacked carefully as if hidden in haste, but with purpose. These weren't ordinary writings. They were ancient Christian texts written in Coptic, a language used in Egypt during the early centuries of Christianity, and they would soon change how scholars understand the birth of the Christian world. At the time, the men who found the jar had no idea they were holding one of the most important discoveries in religious history. Egypt, in the mid-20th century, was a place where ancient objects often surfaced, and fear of spirits or legal trouble surrounded such finds. The jar was opened cautiously, and the books inside were at risk of being damaged, sold, or even burned. Yet, enough survived to reach scholars who recognized their value. These manuscripts were later dated to around the 4th century, but the texts themselves were written much earlier, some as early as the 2nd century. This places their ideas at the very heart of early Christian debate, when beliefs about God, creation, and salvation were still being argued and defined. What made this discovery so powerful was not just the age of the books, but what they contained. These texts presented versions of Christian thought that did not survive in church tradition. They spoke of hidden knowledge, complex cosmologies, and a universe far more layered than the one later taught as official doctrine. Until this discovery, much of what was known about these ideas came only from their critics. Early church leaders who described them as dangerous or false. Now the original voices were speaking for themselves. The location of the find also mattered. Nag Hammadi sat near early Christian communities and monasteries, suggesting these books were once read, copied, and discussed by real believers, not secret cults or distant rebels. Many scholars believe the texts were buried deliberately, possibly in response to growing pressure from church authorities to destroy non-approved writings. If true, the jar becomes more than a container. It becomes a moment frozen in time when ideas were hidden to survive. This discovery did not rewrite history overnight, but it opened a door that had been sealed for over 1,500 years. The ground of Upper Egypt did not just preserve books, it preserved questions the early church tried to close. Those questions still echo today, challenging certainty and reminding us that the beginnings of Christianity weren't simple or unified, but filled with voices competing to define truth, authority, and the meaning of knowledge itself buried quietly, until chance and time allowed them to be heard. After the jar was opened near Nag Hammadi, the discovery did not travel cleanly from the soil into the hands of historians. Instead, it slipped into a shadowy path of rumor, fear, and fragmented custody. In the months following 1945, the papyrus books moved quietly through local villages, antiquities dealers, and family homes. Some pages were damaged, others separated, and at least one codex was reportedly used as fuel for cooking fires before anyone understood what they were. Egypt at this time had strict antiquities laws, and fear of government punishment made many people hide or secretly sell what they found. As a result, the manuscripts entered the black market, where their importance was not yet clear, only their age. Dealers treated them as curiosities, not as historical keys. For several years, no single authority knew how many books existed or where they had gone. This confusion allowed rumors to grow. Stories spread of forbidden gospels, secret Christian writings, and lost scriptures that challenged the Bible itself. Without scholars involved, speculation moved faster than facts. It was not until the late 1940s that officials from the Egyptian Department of Antiquities began to recover parts of the collection. Slowly, the codices were gathered, though not without resistance from sellers who feared losing profit. During this period, fragments reached Cairo, while one complete book, later known as the Young Codex, left Egypt entirely, passing through European hands. The academic world only began to understand the magnitude of the find when trained scholars were finally allowed to examine the texts. In the early 1950s, specialists in Coptic language realized these writings were not medieval copies, but late antique manuscripts preserving much older ideas. Names mentioned in early church, attacks on heresy suddenly appeared in original form. Texts long dismissed as myths were now physically present. Scholars such as Jean Dorès and others began reconstructing the discovery story, interviewing witnesses, tracking ownership, and piecing together how the books were found and dispersed. This slow process corrected many early exaggerations. The manuscripts were not magical relics or proof of a hidden religion ruling the past, but they were authentic witnesses to early Christian diversity. As translations progressed, excitement replaced rumor. Universities and research institutes recognized that the history of Christianity could no longer rely only on texts approved by later church councils. The uneven journey from soil to scholarship shaped how the Nag Hammadi library was received. Because the discovery passed through secrecy and delay, it gained an aura of mystery that still surrounds it today. Yet, beneath that aura lies a clear historical reality. These books survived not because they were powerful legends, but because chance, caution, and time allowed them to avoid destruction. Their slow arrival into academic hands reminds us that history is often not revealed cleanly, but through confusion first and clarity later, when evidence finally speaks louder than rumor. When people hear the phrase Nag Hammadi Library, it is easy to imagine a formal archive or a planned collection gathered by scholars. But that image is misleading. What was found near Nag Hammadi was not a library in the modern sense, but a group of books hidden together at one moment in time. The collection consists of 13 papyrus codices containing more than 50 separate writings, known as tractates. These texts were written in Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, using a Greek-based alphabet. Linguistic study shows that many of these works were originally composed in Greek during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, then later translated for Egyptian Christian communities. The writings include Gospels, Revelations, prayers, philosophical reflections, and complex cosmological explanations. Many are associated with traditions often labeled Gnostic, though that term itself covers a wide range of beliefs rather than a single movement. Others fit more broadly within early Christian thought, and show how flexible belief was before doctrine became fixed. What unites these texts is not a secret organization or a single teacher, but a shared interest in knowledge as a path to salvation. In these writings, knowing who you are, where the soul came from, and how the universe is structured is central to spiritual freedom. This stands in contrast to later church teachings that focused more heavily on obedience, creed, and institutional authority. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal that early Christianity was not one voice, but many, speaking at the same time, often disagreeing, yet all claiming connection to Jesus and his message. Some writings present Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom rather than a public miracle worker. Others retell biblical stories with added layers of meaning, placing events within vast cosmic dramas involving divine realms and spiritual beings. Importantly, these works were not fringe fantasies created centuries later. Church fathers such as Irenaeus and Tertullian criticized many of these same ideas in the 2nd century, which confirms that similar texts were already circulating. The Nag Hammadi library therefore gives scholars direct access to voices that were previously known only through their opponents. It does not replace the New Testament, nor does it cancel traditional Christianity, but it complicates the picture. It shows that what later became called orthodoxy was one outcome among many possibilities. The term library today is a convenient label, but historically these books were likely personal or communal reading material, hidden together to protect them. They survived not because they were central, but because they were pushed aside. In their survival, they now stand as evidence that early Christian history was richer, more diverse, and more uncertain than later tradition allowed people to remember. This collection forces modern readers to face an uncomfortable truth that religious history was shaped by choice, selection, and exclusion, and that many sincere believers once held views later judged unacceptable, simply because power eventually decided which stories would continue and which would be silenced across generations through authority and tradition. The form of the Nag Hammadi texts matters as much as their content, because they were not written on scrolls, but as codices, early book forms made of folded pages bound together. In the ancient world, scrolls were the standard way to preserve literature, especially in Greek and Roman culture. Scrolls were long, fragile, and difficult to navigate, forcing readers to move in a straight line from beginning to end. The Codex changed this experience completely. Pages could be flipped, sections compared, and multiple texts gathered into a single volume. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians were among the earliest and most consistent users of the Codex, choosing it over scrolls, even when other traditions resisted the change. This choice was practical, but also symbolic. The Codex allowed communities to organize teachings, copy texts more efficiently, and share ideas across distance and time. The Nag Hammadi codices show this transition clearly. Each book contains multiple writings, sometimes unrelated in theme, suggesting intentional compilation rather than casual storage. This tells us that early Christian groups were not only producing ideas, but actively shaping how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The physical structure reflects a growing sense of identity and continuity. These were texts meant to be read, studied, and revisited, not performed once and set aside. The codices also reveal a culture of learning that valued comparison and interpretation. Readers could move between texts, reflect on contradictions, and develop layered understanding. This kind of engagement supports the idea that early Christianity was intellectually active, not passive or uniform. The materials themselves confirm this. Leather covers, careful stitching, and consistent handwriting suggest skilled production, likely within organized communities. This was not random copying by isolated individuals. It required training, resources, and time. The shift from scroll to codex also made censorship more effective. A codex could be confiscated, hidden, or destroyed as a single object, unlike scattered scrolls. When church authorities later began limiting acceptable texts, codices became easier targets. This may explain why collections like Nag Hammadi were buried whole rather than disperse. Their form made them portable, but also vulnerable. The irony is that the same format that helped these ideas spread also made them easier to suppress. By choosing the codex, early Christians helped invent the book as we know it, shaping the future of reading itself. Yet, not all books were treated equally. The codices that survived were those hidden away, while others were copied openly and absorbed into official tradition. The physical evidence of the Nag Hammadi books reminds us that history is shaped not only by what is written, but by how it is written, stored, and controlled. The book form was a tool of memory, but also a tool of power, deciding which voices could travel forward and which would be stopped at the edge of time. In that choice of pages bound together, we can see the beginning of both preservation and exclusion unfolding at the same moment quietly, over centuries, slowly, unnoticed. To understand the Nag Hammadi texts, we must first understand the world that produced them, because they did not appear in isolation or secrecy, but in one of the most intellectually active regions of the ancient world. Roman Egypt, during the first 3 centuries after Christ, was a crossroads of ideas, languages, and beliefs. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious traditions, Jewish theology, and emerging Christian thought all existed side by side, often within the same cities. Alexandria, in particular, was famous for its libraries, schools, and debates, where teachers argued openly about the nature of the universe, the soul, and the divine. This was not a world where belief was settled. It was a marketplace of ideas, competitive and creative, where different answers to the same questions were constantly tested. Christianity itself was still forming, and no single authority yet controlled how its message should be understood. Some believers focused on Jesus as a teacher of wisdom, others as a divine savior, and others as a cosmic revealer sent to awaken humanity from ignorance. Alongside them were groups later labeled Gnostic, who believed salvation came through knowledge of divine origins, not simply faith or obedience. Platonic philosophers debated invisible realms and eternal forms, while Hermetic writers blended Greek philosophy with Egyptian symbolism, teaching that humans could ascend spiritually by understanding the structure of the cosmos. These were not fringe movements. They were respected intellectual traditions, with students, texts, and teachers. In this environment, ideas moved freely. Texts were copied, translated, and adapted. A Christian writing could borrow Platonic language. A philosophical treatise could include biblical imagery. Boundaries between religion and philosophy were fluid, not fixed. This explains why the Nag Hammadi library contains such a wide range of material that feels unfamiliar to later Christianity. These texts reflect a time when asking questions was central to spiritual life. People debated where the world came from, why suffering existed, and whether the creator of the material world was the highest divine power or a lesser one. These debates were not abstract. They shaped how people lived, prayed, and understood themselves. Over time, however, this openness began to narrow. As Christian communities grew, leaders sought unity and clear teaching to protect believers from confusion. By the late 2nd century, bishops increasingly argued that too many interpretations weakened the faith. Certain ideas were labeled dangerous, not because they lacked followers, but because they challenged authority. The religious marketplace slowly transformed into a regulated space. In that shift, many voices were pushed out. The Nag Hammadi texts come from the moment just before that door closed. They preserve the sound of arguments that were once normal, but later forbidden. Roman Egypt was the perfect place for such writings to exist because it allowed diversity long enough for these ideas to be written down. When later generations looked back, they called this period confused or heretical. But, in truth, it was a time of exploration. The world that produced these texts wasn't lost or ignorant. It was alive with questions that history later tried to silence. To modern readers, the word cosmology may sound distant or abstract, but for the communities behind the Nag Hammadi texts, it was the center of everything. Cosmology explained why the world exists, why suffering is present, and how the soul can escape confusion and return to its divine source. These writings do not treat the universe as a simple backdrop to human life. Instead, they describe it as a layered structure filled with meaning, purpose, and danger. In many of these texts, the universe is presented as a series of realms or levels, each one farther from the original divine fullness. Human beings are placed within this structure not by accident, but as participants in a cosmic drama. To know where you stand in the universe is to understand who you truly are. This is why cosmology mattered so deeply. It was not about stars and planets alone. It was about identity and salvation. The Nag Hammadi writings often begin with creation stories that differ sharply from later Orthodox teaching. Rather than a single all-powerful creator, they describe emanations flowing from a hidden ultimate source. From this source came divine beings, wisdom figures, and eventually the flawed creation of the material world. These stories were not meant to insult creation, but to explain why the world feels broken. Suffering was not seen as punishment, but as a result of distance from divine knowledge. The soul, according to these texts, carries a spark of the divine trapped within matter. Salvation therefore meant awakening. Learning the truth about the universe allowed the soul to remember its origin and find the path back. These cosmic maps served as guides. They taught believers how to see past appearances and recognize the deeper structure of reality. This way of thinking was common in the ancient world. Greek philosophy, especially Platonism, also taught that the visible world was only a shadow of a higher reality. The Nag Hammadi texts blended this philosophical language with Christian themes. Jesus is often presented not as a ruler enforcing belief, but as a revealer who explains the universe and teaches souls how to ascend. This made cosmology dangerous to later church leaders. If salvation came through understanding rather than obedience, authority shifted away from institutions and toward personal insight. Cosmology empowered individuals to question the world around them and the structures that claimed control. This is one reason these texts were later rejected. They offered a vision of the universe that reduced fear and replaced it with understanding. For believers, knowing the cosmic order meant freedom from ignorance and control. The universe was no longer a prison without explanation. It was a system that could be understood and navigated. That promise was powerful. Even today, these writings remind us that early Christianity was not only concerned with rules and morality, but with the deepest questions humans can ask about where they come from and where they are going, and whether the soul truly belongs here at all. Still unanswered. At the heart of what later writers called Gnosticism lies a simple but unsettling idea that salvation comes through knowing rather than obeying. The word gnosis means knowledge, not information learned by memory, but insight that changes how a person understands reality and themselves. In the Nag Hammadi texts, this knowledge is not reserved for priests or institutions. It is something revealed directly to the individual, often through awakening, reflection, and recognition of one's divine origin. Across different schools and writings, this idea appears again and again. Humanity is described as living in forgetfulness, unaware of where it came from or why it exists. The role of the spiritual teacher is not to command belief, but to remind the soul of what it already carries within. This stands in sharp contrast to the form of Christianity that later became dominant, where salvation depended on shared creed, public confession, and obedience to authority. In the Gnostic view, repeating words without understanding meant nothing. What mattered was inner transformation. Many Nag Hammadi texts describe Jesus not primarily as a sacrifice, but as a revealer of hidden truth. He speaks in riddles, dialogues, and symbolic language meant to provoke insight rather than agreement. His message is not presented as something to accept blindly, but something to discover. This approach made gnosis deeply personal. Two people could hear the same words and walk away changed in different ways. That flexibility was powerful, but it was also dangerous to any institution trying to enforce unity. If salvation depended on understanding, then no external authority could fully control who was saved. Knowledge could not be policed as easily as belief. This is why early church leaders repeatedly attacked gnosis as prideful or deceptive. They argued that private insight led to chaos and division. Yet, the persistence of these texts shows that many believers found this path meaningful and sincere. Historically, gnosis did not reject community or ethics. Many Gnostic groups lived disciplined lives and valued moral behavior. The difference was motivation. Good actions were not performed out of fear of punishment, but as a natural result of awakening. When someone truly understood their divine origin, they were expected to live differently. Knowledge and behavior were linked. The Nag Hammadi writings reveal that this was not a fringe idea held by a few radicals. It was a serious spiritual option within early Christianity. Over time, as the Church aligned more closely with political power, such inward-focused salvation became a threat. Public creed could be monitored, inner knowledge could not. By labeling gnosis as heresy, leaders shifted Christianity toward uniform belief and away from personal discovery. What was lost was not just certain texts, but an entire way of understanding salvation. The idea that knowing who you are and where you come from could be enough. That truth, once buried, never fully disappeared. It waited quietly in hidden books until it could speak again. Across centuries of silence, still, questioned, remembered, feared, preserved, hidden, returned, slowly, today. In many of the Nag Hammadi texts, the idea of God is not simple or singular. Instead, several writings describe a layered divinity, where the highest God is hidden, unknowable, and perfect. This ultimate God exists beyond the material universe and cannot be approached directly by ordinary humans. Below this highest God is a figure often called the demiurge, a lesser creator responsible for shaping the material world. The demiurge is not evil in all texts, but it is limited, flawed, and often unaware of the higher realities above it. This distinction explains why the world can appear imperfect or unjust while still being part of a divine plan. Humans, according to these texts, contain sparks of the higher divine within themselves, trapped in the physical body created by the demiurge. Knowledge of the layered divinity allows the soul to awaken and recognize its origin, understanding that its ultimate source lies beyond the visible cosmos. This concept differs sharply from later Orthodox Christianity, where God is singular, all-powerful, and the direct creator of everything. In these Gnostic writings, the material world is a place of limitation, distraction, and illusion, while the true God exists in fullness beyond perception. Texts such as the Apocryphon of John and the Hypostasis of the Archons describe the demiurge as arrogant, claiming to be the sole God while unknowingly operating under the higher will. These stories often name the demiurge as Yaldabaoth, a figure ignorant of the realms above. The contrast between the demiurge and the ultimate God is central to understanding salvation in Gnostic thought. Liberation comes from recognizing the difference, learning that the visible world is not the ultimate reality, and seeking reunion with the hidden God. This cosmology also helps explain why so many early Christian communities were diverse in belief. Not all teachers emphasized the demiurge in the same way, and interpretations varied widely. Some texts portray the demiurge as malevolent, while others describe it as simply ignorant or limited. In all cases, the layered divinity challenges the idea that the material world is perfect, or that obedience alone guarantees spiritual success. Knowledge is essential because it allows the soul to see beyond appearances, to discern truth from illusion, and to reclaim the divine spark within. Understanding this hierarchy of divinity was considered dangerous by later church authorities, because it suggested that ordinary believers could access hidden truths without mediation by priests or bishops. It shifted authority from external institutions to personal insight and gnosis. The notion of a creator below the highest God also influenced philosophical debates in Roman Egypt, where Platonists and other thinkers were already exploring multiple levels of reality. By framing creation in layers, the Nag Hammadi texts connected Christian ideas with broader intellectual currents, showing that early religious thought was exploratory, diverse, and willing to question simple explanations for existence. Recognizing the demiurge and the hidden God is therefore not just a theological detail, but a key to understanding the spiritual psychology and cosmology of these early communities. The Apocryphon of John is one of the most detailed and influential texts in the Nag Hammadi library, because it lays out a complete cosmology that early Gnostic Christians used to understand the universe and the soul's place within it. This text exists in multiple versions, showing that it was copied, adapted, and circulated widely among communities seeking hidden knowledge. At the center of its teaching is the concept of divine fullness, often called the pleroma, a realm of perfect and infinite spiritual realities emanating from the highest God. Within the pleroma, each emanation or aeon represents aspects of the divine mind, spirit, and truth. One of the most important figures is Sophia, whose desire to know the ultimate source independently triggers a crisis. Her act creates imbalance, leading to the formation of the material world, which is flawed and separate from the pleroma. The text identifies a lesser creator, the demiurge, responsible for shaping the physical universe. The Apocryphon describes how the demiurge, unaware of the higher fullness, arrogantly claims to be the only God and generates rulers, called archons, to enforce control over the material realm. Humanity, in turn, is created by the demiurge, but each person carries a divine spark trapped in matter. Salvation, according to the Apocryphon, comes from acquiring gnosis, knowledge that awakens the soul to its origin and guides it back to the pleroma. Readers are taught to recognize the difference between the false authority of the material realm and the true reality of the divine fullness. The text uses vivid imagery, mythological language, and symbolic characters to communicate these ideas. Sophia's crisis is not punishment, but a necessary step for human awakening, showing that error and limitation are part of the cosmic process. The Apocryphon also emphasizes that revelation is personal. The knowledge is revealed to those ready to receive it, rather than imposed through public ritual. Historically, the text reflects debates in 2nd century Christianity over authority, creation, and salvation. Church leaders, including Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, criticized these teachings as heretical, labeling them dangerous because they suggested that salvation could bypass institutional control. The multiple versions of the Apocryphon found at Nag Hammadi indicate that it was influential and widely circulated, preserving details that Orthodox texts ignored. Scholars note that its Greek origins likely date to the early 2nd century, making it contemporary with other early Christian debates and philosophical influences from Platonism and Hermetic thought. The Apocryphon's structured explanation of emanations, Sophia's crisis, and the demiurge's construction of the material world provides a blueprint for understanding Gnostic cosmology. It demonstrates how early Christians used complex narratives to explain why the universe exists, why humans suffer, and how spiritual liberation can occur. The text bridges theology, philosophy, and spiritual psychology, showing that knowledge, not just belief, is central to salvation. The Apocryphon of John therefore remains one of the clearest windows into the intellectual and spiritual life of early Gnostic communities, revealing a cosmology that was carefully organized, profoundly symbolic, and meant to guide the soul toward awakening and reunion with the divine. Valentinian Gnosticism represents one of the most organized and philosophically developed strands within early Christian thought, and it is well represented in texts like the tripartite tractate found at Nag Hammadi. Named after the teacher Valentinus, who was active in Rome during the 2nd century, this tradition sought to present a coherent explanation of creation, the structure of the divine, and the path to salvation. The tripartite tractate divides its teaching into 3 parts, addressing the origin of the spiritual world, the fall of humanity into matter, and the process of redemption. It describes the pleroma, a fullness of divine emanations, similar to what is seen in the Apocryphon of John, but with a systematic and almost philosophical clarity. Each aeon represents qualities of the divine, and together they form an intricate hierarchy that maintains balance and harmony. Human beings, according to Valentinian thought, contain elements of both spirit and matter. The spiritual component originates from the pleroma, a spark trapped in the material world, which is ruled by lower powers unaware of the higher reality. The tripartite tractate emphasizes that salvation requires awakening to this truth through gnosis, insight that allows the soul to ascend past ignorance, the influence of archons, and the limitations imposed by the material cosmos. What makes Valentinian Gnosticism notable is the way it integrates ethical and social dimensions with cosmology. Knowledge is not purely abstract. It informs how believers live, interact, and understand their role in the world. By presenting a carefully ordered cosmology, the Valentinians offered clarity in a landscape of competing interpretations. They believed that the human journey is a process of discovering one's divine origin and achieving restoration to the pleroma. The tripartite tractate also demonstrates how diverse early Gnostic thought was, showing that there was no single agreed-upon story or method. Different communities emphasized different ions, moral teachings, or rituals, but all shared the principle that knowledge is transformative. Valentinian writings also illustrate the sophistication of early theological argument. They were composed with attention to structure, logical flow, and philosophical terminology influenced by Greek thought, connecting Christian ideas with contemporary intellectual currents. Church fathers, such as Irenaeus, specifically mention Valentinus and his followers as influential yet heretical, because they offered a detailed alternative to the emerging Orthodox doctrine. The systematic nature of Valentinian cosmology shows how early Christians were experimenting with ways to make sense of human suffering, divine justice, and the problem of evil. By framing creation as a series of emanations and fall and redemption as a return through knowledge, the Valentinians created a narrative that was internally consistent, morally instructive, and spiritually liberating. The tripartite tractate remains a key text for understanding this branch of Gnosticism, revealing how diverse and intellectual early Christian thought could be. It demonstrates that what later became orthodoxy was one of many possibilities, and that communities like the Valentinians sought to map the universe and human destiny in ways that emphasized insight, autonomy, and the transformative power of knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the most intriguing texts in the Nag Hammadi library, because it differs dramatically from the narrative Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Rather than telling a continuous story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, Thomas preserves 114 sayings attributed to him, often cryptic and aimed at guiding the listener towards self-discovery and inner insight. This hidden saying tradition emphasizes the process of spiritual awakening, teaching that understanding comes from within rather than being delivered as doctrine from external authority. Many sayings challenge conventional beliefs about sin, obedience, and divine reward, suggesting that enlightenment comes through recognition of the divine spark already present in each person. Unlike narrative Gospels that describe events in chronological order, Thomas presents teachings in a form that encourages reflection, questioning, and interpretation. Scholars date the original compositions that underlie Thomas to the early 2nd century, and likely in Greek before being translated into Coptic by Egyptian Christian communities. Its language is concise, sometimes paradoxical, creating a mental exercise for the reader or hearer, designed to disrupt habitual thinking and provoke gnosis. The text reflects a broader cultural environment in Roman Egypt, where Jewish, Christian, Platonic, and Hermetic ideas mingled, allowing for creative spiritual expression. The Gospel of Thomas emphasizes that the kingdom of God is already present for those who can perceive it, a radically inward-focused notion contrasting with later Orthodox teachings that positioned salvation within institutional structures and external rituals. Some sayings parallel canonical Gospels, suggesting shared traditions, while others are unique, revealing alternative interpretations of Jesus' message. This mixture illustrates that early Christianity was not monolithic, but consisted of multiple communities exploring how divine knowledge could transform human life. Thomas encourages the believer to look inward, to interpret teachings personally, and to achieve spiritual maturity through understanding rather than compliance. The text's preservation within the Nag Hammadi codices also highlights why such writings were hidden, as they challenged centralized authority and promoted individual empowerment. Modern scholarship recognizes Thomas as a vital resource for understanding early Christian diversity, showing that followers of Jesus were experimenting with forms of teaching that prioritized insight, reflection, and direct engagement with the divine. Its influence extends beyond historical curiosity, demonstrating that early Gnostic thought provided a path for spiritual autonomy, and that the words of Jesus could be a map to awaken the inner self. The Gospel of Thomas stands as a testament to a Christianity that valued knowledge, discovery, and the cultivation of spiritual maturity above narrative storytelling or doctrinal conformity. Its preservation allows contemporary readers to glimpse the intellectual and spiritual creativity of early Christian communities and their pursuit of hidden wisdom. The Gospel of Truth presents a strikingly different understanding of Christianity, focusing not on historical events or moral commandments, but on the condition of ignorance and the transformative power of knowledge. In this text, ignorance is depicted as a wound, a separation from the divine fullness that exists beyond the material world. Truth, or gnosis, is the cure, the revelation that allows the soul to recognize its origin and its connection to the ultimate God. Unlike narrative Gospels, the Gospel of Truth is largely poetic and philosophical, emphasizing concepts rather than chronology, and it challenges readers to reconsider what it means for news to be good. Salvation is not framed as obedience to laws or participation in rituals, but as awakening to understanding, as remembering what has been forgotten. This emphasis on memory and forgetting is central. Humans are portrayed as having lost sight of their divine nature through the ignorance imposed by the material world and the archons who govern it. The text repeatedly underscores that recovery of truth is a process of inner discovery, not passive reception. The work is believed to have been composed in the early 2nd century, likely in Greek and translated into Coptic for Egyptian communities. It reflects a Gnostic perspective in which Christ is the revealer of truth, guiding the soul to perceive reality beyond illusion and limitation. The Gospel of Truth blends elements of Platonic philosophy with Christian theology, presenting the world as a place of imperfection caused by distance from divine knowledge. The language is rich with metaphors, describing the soul as lost, the truth as a light, and revelation as a healing agent. In this framework, knowledge is a restorative force, repairing the separation between human beings and the divine. The text also challenges conventional ideas about salvation, suggesting that institutional authority and ritual observance alone cannot restore what has been forgotten. Instead, awakening must be personal, a recognition of one's place in the cosmos and an understanding of the hidden structure of reality. Scholars note that the gospel of truth was valued by communities that sought intellectual and spiritual rigor, combining mystical insight with philosophical reflection. Its preservation within the Nag Hammadi codices demonstrates that it was considered important enough to hide and protect, perhaps because its teachings conflicted with emerging orthodox authority. Today, the gospel of truth provides insight into a Christianity that prioritized comprehension and inner transformation over conformity, showing that early believers were experimenting with the meaning of the good news, the gospel, in ways that emphasized insight, clarity, and the healing of the mind and soul. Its message reminds modern readers that understanding, reflection, and knowledge were once considered essential to spiritual life. The treatise on the resurrection is one of the Nag Hammadi texts that reveals early Christian debates about what resurrection truly means. Unlike later Orthodox interpretations that often focus on a single future event, in which bodies are physically raised, these writings present multiple possibilities, exploring whether resurrection is already occurring spiritually, whether it is purely bodily, or a combination of both. In these texts, resurrection is closely linked to knowledge and awakening. The soul is considered alive even before death, when it recognizes its divine origin and escapes attachment to the material world. Some passages emphasize that the body itself is a temporary vessel, and that true resurrection is the transformation of consciousness, a process that begins in this life. Other passages discuss future resurrection, but always in a symbolic or spiritualized way, showing that early Christians did not uniformly expect a literal reanimation of flesh. The text uses philosophical and mystical language to describe how humans can participate in resurrection through understanding, ethical behavior, and insight into the structure of the universe. Salvation and resurrection are interconnected, because the soul's awareness of divine truth allows it to transcend the limitations of matter. The treatise also highlights debates within second-century Christian communities, where leaders and theologians were already arguing about proper doctrine. These discussions reflect a broader diversity in belief, with some groups emphasizing personal spiritual experience over institutional authority or literal interpretation of Scripture. Scholars date the composition of the treatise on the resurrection to the early 2nd century, likely written originally in Greek and later translated into Coptic, similar to other Nag Hammadi texts. The text provides insight into how early Christians navigated the tension between material life and spiritual destiny, showing that resurrection was not a monolithic concept, but a dynamic idea with multiple interpretations. It also demonstrates the influence of Gnostic thought, where knowledge, not ritual, is key to spiritual progress. Resurrection, in this framework, is less about miraculous events imposed from outside and more about inner transformation that aligns the soul with its divine source. The text encourages readers to rethink traditional assumptions, suggesting that resurrection can be a lived experience rather than only a future hope. It also connects with other themes in the Nag Hammadi library, including the layered divinity, the role of the demiurge, and the journey of the soul through knowledge. The treatise on the resurrection reminds modern readers that early Christian communities were intellectually and spiritually diverse, actively questioning and interpreting fundamental doctrines, and that the concept of resurrection was a central topic of exploration, debate, and reflection. Understanding this helps contextualize why later Orthodox Christianity adopted a more uniform view, and it illustrates how these texts preserve alternative ways of thinking about life, death, and the continuation of the soul. The Nag Hammadi library is not solely a repository of Gnostic Christian writings, but also includes texts that connect with broader intellectual traditions of the ancient world, showing that these communities were engaged with diverse philosophies and teachings. Among the codices are works related to the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greek and Egyptian writings focused on spiritual knowledge, cosmology, and the nature of the divine. These Hermetic texts emphasize the ascent of the soul, the unity of mind and cosmos, and the pursuit of wisdom, ideas that resonated with Gnostic thought. Additionally, scholars have identified reworked portions of Plato's Republic within the library, indicating that early Christians and related groups were not isolated from classical philosophy. Plato's ideas on justice, the ideal state, and the nature of knowledge were adapted and interpreted in ways that intersected with theological concerns. This suggests that the intellectual environment of Roman Egypt encouraged the blending of philosophical, religious, and mystical traditions. The presence of Hermetic and Platonic texts alongside Gnostic works illustrates that early Christian communities were actively exploring multiple pathways to understanding the universe and the human soul. They were not content with a single source of authority, but sought insight from a range of teachings, integrating and reinterpreting them for their own spiritual purposes. Scholars date these texts from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, showing that this engagement with broader intellectual traditions spanned centuries and was part of the ongoing development of early Christian and Gnostic thought. The inclusion of Hermetic and Platonic material also reveals the educational and cultural context of the codices. Communities that produced these books had access to libraries, schools, and intellectual networks, where Greek philosophy, Egyptian wisdom, literature, and emerging Christian texts could circulate and influence one another. This exposure allowed authors to synthesize ideas, create allegorical interpretations, and present complex cosmologies and ethical systems. Furthermore, these texts demonstrate that early Christianity was not monolithic. While later orthodoxy emphasized a fixed canon and a single doctrinal path, communities using the Nag Hammadi library were experimenting with diverse forms of knowledge, dialogue, and interpretation. Hermetic and Platonic influences provided frameworks for thinking about the divine, the human soul, and the material world, complementing Gnostic teachings about knowledge, awakening, and salvation. Their presence in the library shows that early Christian thought was intellectually vibrant and open to cross-cultural exchange. The Nag Hammadi library, therefore, offers a snapshot of a time when ideas flowed freely between religious and philosophical traditions, creating a rich tapestry of thought that challenged simple definitions of orthodoxy. By including Hermetic and Platonic texts alongside Gnostic works, the library preserves evidence of a broader intellectual bookshelf than church-only material, showing that early seekers of knowledge were curious, experimental, and willing to integrate wisdom from multiple sources to understand the mysteries of existence, the divine, and the journey of the soul. The process of banning and labeling texts as heretical emerged gradually as early Christian leaders sought to define what counted as orthodox teaching. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity was not a single unified religion, but a collection of communities with diverse interpretations of Jesus' message, different understandings of salvation, and varying cosmologies. Bishops and church authorities began to assert control over doctrine to create consistency and authority across regions, aiming to prevent confusion among believers and to maintain unity within growing Christian populations. Competing texts, including Gnostic writings, Hermetic texts, and alternative gospels, were increasingly viewed as threats because they offered interpretations that challenged the emerging hierarchy. Leaders such as Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century, explicitly criticized Valentinian, Scythian, and other Gnostic schools for presenting alternative paths to salvation, arguing that such teachings were dangerous and misleading. The creation of boundaries was both theological and practical. It involved deciding which texts were authoritative, which teachings could be transmitted, and which communities could operate freely. Works like the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Truth were gradually excluded from public circulation because they promoted personal gnosis over obedience to church authority. The labeling of heresy was not simply about disagreement. It was a method of enforcing intellectual and spiritual conformity. Communities found in possession of banned texts risked censure, exclusion, or other forms of social and religious pressure. Over time, these boundaries became more formalized. The canon of the New Testament was developed. Lists of acceptable and prohibited books were compiled, and bishops asserted the right to interpret Scripture authoritatively. By the 4th century, under emperors such as Constantine and later Theodosius, these decisions were reinforced with legal and political authority, further narrowing the scope of what counted as legitimate Christianity. The effect of these boundaries was profound. Texts that offered alternative cosmologies, ethical teachings, or methods of spiritual awakening were removed from general circulation, hidden in private collections, or lost entirely. Communities that had relied on these writings had to adapt or risk isolation. The rise of boundaries reshaped the intellectual landscape of early Christianity, defining orthodoxy by what was preserved, promoted, and publicly taught, while marginalizing those paths that emphasized personal insight, philosophical engagement, or alternative cosmologies. This process shows that the history of Christian thought is not simply about belief, but about control over knowledge, teaching, and interpretation. It explains why so many of the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden or buried, allowing their insights to survive outside the mainstream and providing modern scholars with a window into the diversity of early Christian thought. The rise of boundaries demonstrates that what counts as legitimate belief has always been shaped by authority, negotiation, and the power to define what is allowed to be known and transmitted across generations. In the late 2nd century, Irenaeus of Lyons became one of the most influential voices in defining Orthodox Christianity and countering what he called heresies. His work, Against Heresies, written around 185, systematically catalogued the beliefs of various Gnostic and other rival groups, including the Valentinians, Scythians, and others who offered alternative cosmologies and interpretations of Jesus' teachings. Irenaeus argued that these groups distorted the apostolic faith handed down from the original disciples and threatened the unity of Christian communities. He emphasized that true knowledge of God and salvation was only found through adherence to the teachings preserved in the churches and the emerging canon of Scripture. Against Heresies is structured to demonstrate both the intellectual and spiritual errors of Gnostic groups, highlighting their cosmologies, mythologies, and ethical teachings as deviations from the faith that had been authorized by the apostles. Irenaeus's goal was not only to correct belief, but to protect communities from confusion and division. By presenting detailed accounts of rival cosmologies, he made it possible for bishops, clergy, and lay people to recognize and reject teachings that contradicted orthodox doctrine. He stressed that salvation depended on living according to the apostolic tradition and participating in sacraments administered by the Church rather than seeking personal enlightenment through hidden knowledge. The work also reveals the methods used to consolidate authority in early Christianity. Irenaeus connected the apostolic succession of bishops to doctrinal accuracy, arguing that the lineage of teaching from the apostles to contemporary church leaders guaranteed access to truth. This strategy positioned institutional authority as the gatekeeper of legitimate faith and knowledge. Irenaeus's critiques had far-reaching consequences. His denunciations helped justify the exclusion of Gnostic texts, the suppression of alternative teachings, and the eventual formation of the Orthodox canon. Communities that continued to promote Gnostic insight faced marginalization, censure, or pressure to conform to the interpretations endorsed by bishops. His work reflects a broader 2nd century context in which Christian leaders were negotiating power, doctrine, and social cohesion in a rapidly expanding religion. The campaign against heresy was as much about preserving institutional control as it was about theological precision. It illustrates the tension between personal spiritual knowledge, emphasized in texts like those found at Nag Hammadi, and the emerging authority of church hierarchy. Irenaeus's Against Heresies serves as a window into how early Christian leaders framed the debate over truth, knowledge, and salvation, showing that what was labeled heretical often represented alternative paths that were vibrant, intellectual, and spiritually compelling. His campaign set a precedent for centuries of ecclesiastical control over doctrine and demonstrates why many Gnostic texts were hidden, ignored, or destroyed, preserving a narrative that privileged institutional authority over personal insight, shaping the trajectory of Christian thought for generations. By the 4th century, the pressure to define orthodoxy and restrict access to non-canonical texts had intensified across the Christian world. One of the most important documents in this effort is the festal letter of Athanasius, written in the year 367. In this letter, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, listed the books that he considered authoritative for Christian communities and emphasized that other writings should not be read publicly or used as instruction. While the letter was addressed primarily to churches in his region, its influence spread widely, contributing to the broader consolidation of the New Testament canon and the marginalization of other Christian literature. This created an environment in which communities who valued alternative gospels, Gnostic writings, or philosophical texts had to make difficult decisions about the preservation of their collections. Codices like those discovered at Nag Hammadi may have been deliberately hidden in response to such pressures, as public possession of non-canonical texts could lead to censure, confiscation, or persecution. The Festal Letter reflects the growing authority of bishops and the institutional church in regulating belief, practice, and access to knowledge. It also illustrates how the process of canonization was not simply about recognizing the most spiritually valuable texts, but about asserting control over what counted as legitimate instruction and faith. In a climate where church leaders were actively discouraging the circulation of alternative writings, communities that maintained collections of Gnostic or Hermetic works faced the challenge of protecting their intellectual and spiritual heritage without attracting unwanted attention. Scholars believe that hiding these texts in sealed jars or secret locations was a practical strategy to ensure their survival. The letter also highlights the centrality of authority in the Christian world of the 4th century, showing that access to knowledge was increasingly mediated through the approval of church leaders. This contrasts sharply with the earlier diversity of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when communities freely explored different interpretations of Jesus' teachings, cosmology, and ethical philosophy. By 367, the establishment of the canon and the promotion of orthodoxy had created a clear boundary between what was considered true teaching and what was dangerous or heretical. The Festal Letter exemplifies the institutional mechanisms by which these boundaries were reinforced. Understanding the context of Athanasius's letter helps explain why the Nag Hammadi codices were buried and remained hidden for centuries. It shows that the preservation of alternative spiritual texts required careful planning, secrecy, and a recognition of the growing power of bishops to define orthodoxy. This moment in history reveals the intersection of authority, fear, and devotion, and underscores that the survival of these writings is due not to chance, but to deliberate actions by communities committed to safeguarding knowledge that the broader church sought to suppress. The Festal Letter thus marks a turning point in the consolidation of Christian literature, emphasizing conformity while inadvertently prompting the concealment of the intellectual diversity that continues to inform our understanding of early Christianity today. Scholars continue to debate the origins and ownership of the Nag Hammadi codices, considering whether they were connected to nearby monastic networks or circulated more broadly among local Christian communities. Some researchers suggest a link to the Pachomian monasteries, which were established in Upper Egypt during the 4th century, and became influential centers of religious practice and learning. These monasteries emphasized communal living, copying texts, and spiritual discipline, making them plausible custodians for a hidden collection of writings. However, the codices themselves include texts that were often labeled heretical by the broader church, raising questions about whether monastic communities, which were generally aligned with Orthodox authority, would have openly preserved such material. Another possibility is that the codices circulated among smaller, independent Christian groups in the region, who valued alternative teachings and sought to protect them from confiscation or censorship. The contents of the codices suggest a community deeply engaged with Gnostic thought, Hermetic philosophy, and reinterpretations of Christian scripture, indicating that they were curated by individuals or groups with specific theological interests. The physical characteristics of the codices, including their leather bindings, Coptic translations, and the careful compilation of multiple works, point to deliberate organization and a degree of literacy and craftsmanship. This supports the idea that the collection was managed by people with knowledge of both textual production and spiritual doctrine. Archaeological and historical evidence shows that monasteries in Upper Egypt were often situated near villages, creating interactions between monks and lay Christians. This raises the possibility that the codices moved through networks of believers, gradually accumulating and eventually being hidden to protect them from ecclesiastical authorities. Scholars also note that the desert environment of Upper Egypt provided a natural place to conceal important documents, whether by monastic custodians or lay collectors. The question of ownership intersects with the broader story of 4th century Christianity, when bishops and councils were defining orthodoxy and establishing the canon, and when texts deemed dangerous or heretical were at risk of suppression. The codices' survival suggests that those who safeguarded them were aware of these pressures and acted intentionally to preserve knowledge for future generations. The debate about whether Pachomian monks or other local Christians were responsible reflects the complexity of early Christian networks and the variety of ways communities engaged with texts, ideas, and spiritual practice. Some scholars argue for shared custody, where monastic and lay groups cooperated in copying, studying, and concealing writings. Others emphasize independent efforts by Gnostic-leaning groups who were distinct from institutional monastic structures. Understanding the question of ownership helps illuminate the social, religious, and intellectual dynamics of 4th century Upper Egypt, and explains how the Nag Hammadi codices survived centuries of potential destruction. It also highlights the careful and strategic actions required to protect spiritual and philosophical knowledge during a period when divergence from official teaching could be dangerous. The codices' preservation ultimately reflects the intersection of devotion, literacy, and community networks committed to safeguarding alternative Christian teachings in an environment of growing orthodoxy and oversight. The burial of the Nag Hammadi codices in a sealed jar is one of the most important factors in their survival and eventual discovery in late 1945. Scholars have proposed several reasons why these texts might have been deliberately hidden, ranging from fear of ecclesiastical confiscation to a simple desire for secure storage. By the 4th century, church authorities were actively restricting access to non-canonical works, and communities that valued Gnostic, Hermetic, or philosophical writings faced potential censure or destruction of their materials. Hiding the codices in a jar could have been a protective strategy to ensure their survival, keeping them away from authorities while preserving the knowledge contained within. The choice of a sealed clay jar, buried in a relatively remote area of Upper Egypt, also served practical purposes. Papyrus is extremely fragile and susceptible to deterioration from exposure to light, moisture, and temperature fluctuations. Encasing the codices in a jar helped shield them from these elements, maintaining the physical integrity of the leather bindings and the Coptic texts over centuries. The desert environment of Nag Hammadi, with its dry air and stable conditions, further contributed to the preservation, slowing decomposition, and allowing the manuscripts to remain readable even after more than 1,500 years. The survival of the texts was therefore both intentional and fortunate, resulting from a combination of human foresight and environmental factors. The decision to bury the codices reflects an understanding of their value and the risks associated with possession. Communities that hid the texts likely recognized that these works contained spiritual and philosophical insights that were not accepted by mainstream Christian authorities. By preserving them in secrecy, they ensured that future generations could access knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The context of the burial also illustrates the broader historical pressures faced by alternative Christian movements in late antiquity. As bishops defined orthodoxy and restricted reading materials, groups holding non-canonical texts had to navigate a landscape where public exposure could threaten both individuals and communities. Hiding writings in jars, caves, or remote locations became a method of safeguarding intellectual and spiritual heritage. The eventual discovery of the codices by farmers in late 1945 was accidental, revealing the success of these preservation strategies. Modern scholars have been able to study the collection because it survived intact, offering an unprecedented window into Gnostic thought, Hermetic influence, and early Christian diversity. The very act of burial, motivated by fear, care, or simple prudence, became the key to their survival. Without this careful concealment, the fragile papyrus would likely have disintegrated long before discovery, and the insights preserved in the Nag Hammadi library might have been lost forever. The survival of the texts underscores the interplay between human decision-making and environmental conditions, showing how a combination of strategy, secrecy, and geography allowed these works to reach the modern era intact, ready to reveal the intellectual richness of early Christian communities. After the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in late 1945, the manuscripts began a complex and sometimes chaotic journey through the antiquities market before reaching secure, institutional custody. Initially, the codices were handled by local dealers in Upper Egypt, who did not fully understand their significance, treating them as rare artifacts rather than as texts of profound historical and spiritual value. This circulation introduced risks of damage, loss, or fragmentation, as individual codices or even separate leaves were sometimes sold to collectors unaware of their connections to the broader collection. One codex, in particular, gained international attention when it became associated with the work of Carl Jung. Jung was fascinated by Gnostic thought and believed that these texts could provide insight into the human psyche, symbolism, and the collective unconscious. This connection highlights how the Nag Hammadi library captured the imagination of both scholars and thinkers interested in spirituality, psychology, and comparative religion. Over the next decade, efforts intensified to trace, catalogue, and consolidate the scattered codices, a process that involved historians, linguists, and archaeologists working in cooperation with local authorities and the Egyptian government. By the late 1950s, most of the collection had been centralized at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where proper conservation methods could be applied to preserve the fragile papyrus and leather bindings. The journey of the codices illustrates both the challenges of preserving ancient texts and the broad impact of their discovery. From local villagers and antiquities dealers to renowned scholars and international institutes, the manuscripts passed through many hands, each stage shaping the way they were studied and interpreted. The association with Jung, while limited to one codex, demonstrates the cross-disciplinary interest these texts generated, influencing not only religious and historical studies, but also psychology and philosophical inquiry. Modern conservation efforts at the museum ensured that the codices were protected from environmental hazards such as humidity, light, and physical handling that could degrade the papyrus, scholars have since been able to study the complete collection in a coordinated manner, allowing for critical editions, translations, and comprehensive analysis of the text's language, themes, and historical context. This phase of the codice's journey underscores the importance of careful stewardship in the survival of fragile documents, showing how the combination of local discovery, international curiosity, and institutional preservation allowed these ancient manuscripts to reach a wider audience. The story of their modern journey also reflects broader questions about ownership, cultural heritage, and the responsibility of collectors and institutions to safeguard texts that hold deep historical and intellectual significance. By consolidating the codices in Cairo, scholars ensured that future generations could access the full range of teachings preserved at Nag Hammadi, enabling the study of early Christian diversity, Gnostic cosmologies, and the broader spiritual landscape of Roman Egypt. The modern journey of the codices, from discovery to museum, highlights both the fragility and resilience of cultural heritage, when human curiosity and care intersect over time. Today, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts are preserved as national property in Egypt, primarily housed at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they benefit from modern conservation and scholarly access. The Egyptian authorities recognized the significance of the discovery and sought to ensure that the codices would remain intact, protected from environmental damage, theft, or dispersion. Over the decades, the museum has implemented climate-controlled storage, specialized handling procedures, and detailed cataloging, allowing the fragile papyrus and leather bindings to survive in remarkably good condition. Scholars from around the world are now able to study the texts under carefully controlled conditions, examining both the Coptic language and the content of each tractate. High-resolution imaging projects have further expanded access, creating digital reproductions that allow researchers to analyze the codices without risking physical deterioration. These efforts have enabled comprehensive translations, critical editions, and comparative studies, making the content of the Nag Hammadi library widely available for academic work while preserving the original manuscripts. The museum's stewardship ensures that the codices are not only protected, but also positioned as a resource for understanding early Christianity, Gnostic thought, Hermetic philosophy, and the intellectual diversity of late antiquity. National ownership also highlights the broader cultural importance of the discovery for Egypt, emphasizing that these texts are part of the country's historical and archaeological heritage. Modern projects have included collaborations with international universities, scholars in religious studies, history, and philology, reflecting the global interest in the manuscript's content. By making digital images and scholarly editions accessible, researchers can study the cosmologies, ethical teachings, and spiritual practices preserved in the texts, fostering new insights into the ways early Christian and Gnostic communities thought about salvation, knowledge, and the universe. The preservation of the manuscripts in Egypt also addresses historical concerns about the dispersal of antiquities during the mid-20th century, when some codices had already entered the antiquities market or private collections. Consolidating the collection in a secure national institution has prevented further loss and ensured that the manuscripts can be studied as an interconnected library rather than as isolated fragments. Today, the Nag Hammadi Library stands as a central reference point for scholars exploring early Christian diversity, providing material evidence of theological debates, philosophical influences, and alternative understandings of Scripture. Access to these codices allows for interdisciplinary study, connecting history, religion, linguistics, and archaeology, and fostering a more nuanced understanding of late antique thought. The museum's role underscores the responsibility of caretakers to balance public access, academic research, and preservation, ensuring that these manuscripts continue to inform scholarship for generations to come. By safeguarding the Nag Hammadi codices, Egypt has maintained both cultural patrimony and an invaluable window into the spiritual and intellectual world of early Christian communities, preserving their legacy while making it possible for modern audiences to engage directly with some of the most important texts from late antiquity. Deciphering the Nag Hammadi codices has been a painstaking process that required specialists to work carefully with the Coptic texts to reconstruct their original Greek compositions. Most of the codices were translated from Greek into Sahidic Coptic during the 3rd and 4th centuries, a process that preserved the content, but also introduced linguistic shifts, variant spellings, and occasional omissions. Modern philologists began studying the manuscripts in the mid-20th century, comparing the Coptic versions with surviving fragments of Greek texts, quotations in early Christian writings, and other related manuscripts. By analyzing parallel passages, sentence structures, and vocabulary, scholars were able to infer the original Greek phrasing and better understand the meaning and nuances of the texts. This work required extensive knowledge of both languages, as well as familiarity with Gnostic terminology, Hermetic thought, and the broader intellectual context of Roman Egypt. Editors produced critical editions that included reconstructed Greek texts alongside Coptic translations, providing a reference for historians, theologians, and linguists. The careful philology also involved assessing variations among different codices, noting where scribes may have introduced errors or made intentional alterations, and determining the most likely original reading. This process allowed scholars to trace the evolution of Gnostic ideas, understand how theological concepts were transmitted across language and cultural boundaries, and reconstruct the philosophical and cosmological frameworks preserved in the manuscripts. Comparative studies showed that some texts had multiple versions, reflecting regional interpretations or different transmission lines, and careful reconstruction helped clarify these relationships. The effort to rebuild the Greek originals has also shed light on how early Christian and Gnostic communities edited, adapted, and interpreted inherited traditions. Through this meticulous work, modern readers can access the original ideas, symbolism, and theological arguments that would otherwise have been obscured by translation or the passage of time. The reconstruction process demonstrates the importance of philology in historical and religious scholarship, highlighting how language and textual analysis are central to understanding the past. Without these efforts, the nuances of cosmology, ethics, and spiritual instruction contained in the Nag Hammadi codices would be lost or misinterpreted. By restoring the Greek originals, scholars have made it possible to see the depth of Gnostic thought, the connections with Platonic philosophy, and the ways in which these writings engaged with broader intellectual currents in late antiquity. The painstaking work of deciphering, editing, and reconstructing these texts continues to provide insights into early Christian diversity, and preserves a window into the spiritual and philosophical questions that shaped the ancient world. Modern readers can now engage with the codices in a way that reflects both their historical context and their original linguistic and conceptual richness, thanks to decades of careful philological scholarship. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in late 1945 had a profound impact on the study of early Christianity, revealing that what had long been dismissed as marginal or heretical actually represented substantial literary and theological traditions. Scholars realized that alternative Christianities, including Gnostic, Hermetic, and other non-Orthodox communities, were not fleeting or isolated movements, but had produced extensive writings, complex cosmologies, and coherent ethical systems. The manuscripts demonstrated that these communities engaged seriously with questions of God, the soul, salvation, and the nature of the material world, often reinterpreting scripture in ways that challenge the emerging orthodoxy. Before Nag Hammadi, much of what was known about these groups came from the writings of opponents like Irenaeus, who portrayed them as deviant or dangerous. The codices provided their own voices, allowing historians to see how these Christians understood themselves and their beliefs. This reshaped the understanding of the early church as a diverse, contested, and intellectually vibrant landscape, rather than a uniform tradition neatly aligned with later orthodoxy. Researchers began to re-examine the role of women, leadership structures, ritual practices, and spiritual exercises, noting that many of these communities valued personal insight, experiential knowledge, and direct engagement with the divine. The codices also highlighted the geographical and cultural diversity of early Christian thought, showing connections across Egypt, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. By analyzing the texts, scholars recognized that alternative communities developed systematic theological frameworks, sophisticated allegorical readings of Scripture, and philosophical arguments that engaged with Greek, Platonic, and Egyptian ideas. The discovery prompted a reassessment of early Christian history, demonstrating that suppression, marginalization, and later canonization decisions shaped the historical record and obscured the richness of competing traditions. It also encouraged interdisciplinary approaches, combining philology, theology, history, and archaeology, to reconstruct the context, authorship, and circulation of the texts. The Nag Hammadi library proved that early Christianity was not monolithic, and that debates about authority, knowledge, and salvation were central to its development. These insights have influenced modern biblical studies, historical theology, and the study of religious diversity, challenging scholars to reconsider what constitutes the early church and how historical narratives are constructed. By bringing these texts to light, Nag Hammadi confirmed that communities outside the eventual orthodoxy were intellectually active, literate, and spiritually serious, providing a more nuanced and complex picture of Christianity in late antiquity. The codices show that early Christians were engaged in dynamic dialogue about faith, cosmology, and practice, and that what survived as orthodoxy represents only a portion of the diverse landscape that once existed. Today, the study of the Nag Hammadi texts continues to reveal how early Christian communities navigated authority, identity, and spiritual knowledge, fundamentally reshaping our understanding of the early church and its intellectual and cultural breadth. The Nag Hammadi library allows us to see early Christianity as a contested and dynamic field, where ideas, texts, and communities competed for legitimacy. The codices reveal that what later became labeled heresy represented serious theological reflection, cosmological speculation, and ethical instruction, not simply aberrant beliefs. By examining these writings, scholars understand that orthodoxy did not emerge naturally or universally, but through debate, exclusion, and the consolidation of authority by bishops and institutional structures over several centuries. The library's cosmic myths, from the Apocryphon of John to the Valentinian tractates, show how early Christians grappled with questions of creation, the nature of the divine, the soul, and salvation, proposing models that were internally coherent and meaningful to their communities. These texts illustrate that knowledge and gnosis were valued alongside faith, and that different groups developed distinct but serious interpretations of Christian teaching. The suppression of these texts, the creation of a canon, and the labeling of alternative beliefs as heresy shaped the historical record, leaving only a partial view of the intellectual diversity of late antiquity. The survival of the codices highlights the deliberate efforts of communities to preserve their ideas despite the pressures of orthodoxy and institutional control. Their rediscovery in 1945 challenges earlier assumptions about the uniformity of early Christian belief and demonstrates that alternative theological frameworks were widespread, literate, and thoughtfully constructed. By studying the codices, historians and scholars are able to reconstruct the social, cultural, and intellectual milieu of Roman Egypt, understanding how early Christians negotiated identity, authority, and spiritual knowledge. The texts show that early Christianity was not monolithic, but a mosaic of debates, interpretations, and practices, each with communities invested in their understanding of God and the universe. In this light, the emergence of orthodoxy can be seen as a process of consensus building that involved the exclusion of certain texts and ideas, the consolidation of doctrinal authority, and the institutionalization of belief. The Nag Hammadi library thus reopens questions about the formation of Christian thought, the role of power in defining legitimate belief, and the ways in which alternative voices were silenced or marginalized. It reminds us that history is shaped by both what survives and what is suppressed, and that recovering hidden texts allows a more accurate understanding of the past. For modern readers, the library offers a window into the rich diversity of early Christian imagination, showing that the spiritual, cosmological, and ethical questions addressed by these communities were profound and sophisticated. The codices challenge us to reconsider the narrative of a single, unified early church, and to recognize the complexity of theological development. They show that orthodoxy emerged not only through inspiration or divine guidance, but also through debate, exclusion, and the exercise of institutional authority. The Nag Hammadi library is therefore a testament to the contested nature of early Christianity, the survival of alternative cosmologies, and the ongoing relevance of questioning how belief, knowledge, and authority intersected in shaping one of the world's major religions.